I'm going to aim to not make this one too long, partly because I'm generally trying to shorten my videos, and also because the subject matter is not a pleasant one. It's a depressing subject, but it is something that I feel needs to be spoken about. Um, one of my intentions when I started off with this channel was to have no issue that was that I felt was important that I would leave off the table. So this is there could be few things in the world right now that is more important than what is going on in Syria. Um, I think it's no exaggeration to say that collectively speaking, Syrian cities, Aleppo in 2016 and the eastern Ghouta district of Damascus now, Homs earlier in the war, Syrian cities are collectively Leningrad of the 21st century. Obviously, the scale is smaller, but in terms of the prolonged state of this conflict, in terms of the suffering, um, I would say it is the 21st century equivalent. There's obviously other wars going on in the world, but none that are so concentrated in urban areas as this one. Um, and it's horrible. It's horrible to think of what is going on out there. Civilians, children being killed every day. I can't even comprehend. I mean, if you look at some basic things, for example, if people have pre-existing medical conditions that aren't necessarily war injuries, they can't get treated because the infrastructure of the country is completely, um, basically in rubble. So if someone has cancer or if they have severe toothache, I mean, that sounds like a very trivial thing to talk about in light of what's going on. But the reason I'm saying that is that I remember last year I had severe toothache and it was horrible. But I did get treatment at the Newcastle Dental Hospital. In Syria, people basically just have to put up with any pain that they're going through. And that is a really depressing thought because the whole infrastructure of the country is wrecked with 7 years of war. Now, I'm not going to be neutral in this video. I'd be lying if I said that was the pitch that I was going to take. Um, Russia has called for a humanitarian pause in recent days, but I think it's the case of too little, too late. And make no mistake about it, Russia has been backing the Assad regime from day one. Not just backing the regime politically, but arming the regime and has itself been involved in outright bombing campaigns. I came across a meme yesterday that I have to say made me very angry because I looked at the source of the meme or the cartoon. Basically, what it showed was a sort of archetypal Uncle Sam, archetypal Turkish politician, and an archetypal Saudi leader. And I think, if I recall, it was the Saudis cradling a dead ISIS fighter, the Americans cradling a dead Al Qaeda fighter, and I forget what the Turkish one was, but basically, then they all three had speech bubbles saying, "Please stop Russia." Now, the implications of that were profound. It was basically towing the propaganda of the Assad regime, and it made me very angry because I looked at the person who was posting it, and their politics was very clear. Um, and that is that Russia is the savior of Syria, which is a cruel joke. And basically, it was getting to the notion that Western countries in particular have no right to criticize Russia because of Western support for Saudi Arabia. Well, that's perhaps a valid argument. The West has been supporting Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has, as we know, been engaging in a brutal war in Yemen. So I'm always quick in these videos, and I made other videos about Syria, to say that from my point of view, it isn't that the West is innocent. But in the case of Syria, definitely Russia is foremost responsible for helping keep the Assad regime in power. And it makes me angry when people come out with sweeping statements like the USA created ISIS. You know, I've seen a lot of people come out with that statement. I'm yet to see anyone provide actual solid evidence that that has been the case. I have no doubt in the quagmire of war that developed, Western money ended up in jihadist hands. There's no doubt about it. Um, but if you have followed this conflict from the start, the fact of the matter is, ISIS and other vicious Islamist groups only took advantage of a situation when the war was being prolonged. ISIS was not there in a big way in 2011. They started coming in 2014 onwards. Thankfully, now they've been defeated in most pockets of Syria, and that seems to be the only good news coming out of that country. But before Russia gets triumphalist about that, it was Russia that helped prolong this war by backing the Assad regime, a regime that is despised by many Syrians. One reason I got angry with the post that was made was the person who was posting it, a Pakistani woman, claimed that she was for secularism and humanism. That made me angry because what she was doing was promoting the propaganda of a brutal dictatorship. Now, Assad may not be an outright Islamist, but he is an absolutely blood drenched dictator who has been directly responsible for tens of thousands of his countrymen's deaths. I mean, it's a sick joke when the Assad regime says that they're only targeting terrorists. If you believe that propaganda, then every man, woman, and child living in Ghouta is a terrorist. And the most sick thing of all is people who are actually saying, oh, they're just actors. It's like what I spoke about with the crisis actors, conspiracy theorists in the case of US shootings. That's bad. This is like that, but on an even bigger scale. The fact there are people out there who are so anti Western that they've convinced themselves that it's all invented to make Assad look bad. That's beyond the pale. I mean, what Russia and the Assad regime are doing is barbaric. And I don't make any apology for using that word because they are killing civilians left, right, and center. This is a regime that has used chemical weapons, that has used barrel bombs. Um, some will say, oh, well, how do you know it was a regime that done it? Don't put it above terrorists. Well, I don't put it above terrorists. I certainly wouldn't put it past the likes of ISIS to want to use those sort of methods, but you have to look at capabilities. And a standing government with a standing army clearly has more capabilities than a terrorist organization as a starting point. I mean, that just goes without saying. So I find it shocking and frankly sickening. There are people out there who are saying that those civilians, those men, women, and children in Ghouta, who who are clearly suffering from the effects of a chemical attack, are making it up. I mean, that's whatever you think of the politics of the situation, to accuse victims of a war crime of inventing it. To me, that's no better than telling Jewish survivors of the Holocaust that they invented it, that the gas camps were just um, that the ovens and the gas chambers were all made up. Now, I'm not saying it's on the same scale, but how people can have such a distorted view of reality is just repugnant, to be quite honest. Um, the horrible thing about this is it's been going on for so long, 7 years now. That's longer than the Bosnian War. It's longer than the Second Chechen War. It's it's a horrible, horrible situation, and it just looks like there's no end in sight to the suffering of the people of Syria. When this does end, it is going to take decades to rebuild, and I don't see any clear way it can end. One thing I will say, some another type of sweeping statement I sometimes see is the world doesn't care. That's not true. I mean, it's the problem is what can, for example, Western countries actually do? It's all very well saying they don't care, but the follow up is okay, what do you want them to actually do? David Cameron, I believe, got it right when he took action against both the Assad regime and ISIS, because both parties are responsible for atrocities. Um, and as always, military action is always controversial. I believe that was morally justified. I believe Hilary Benn at the time made a powerful speech, and I believe Corbyn's hard left were wrong about that because they had no answer in how to deal with ISIS. Their line was war is bad, military action is bad, that's it. But how do you find any moral argument when the alternative is turning a blind eye to that? I didn't see um, any convincing arguments made by the hard left at that time against it. Um, but with Syria, I can't see this ending unless Assad voluntarily leaves power. As for this particular situation in Ghouta, in eastern Ghouta, some of the rebel leaders are saying they're not going to stick by the ceasefire because they have to protect themselves and their families. Now, given the track record of the regime, they're obviously not going to surrender because that would mean getting tortured in Assad's prisons or just being killed on the spot. Um, the Assad regime is never going to back down. That is not in the nature of dictators. This particular dictator has shown that has no intention of stepping down. If Assad died in an airstrike or something, could the war end? I don't know. I don't know because I think some Assad loyalists would then fill the shoes. Sadly, it looks like this is a stalemate situation. Um, so other than calling for a ceasefire, I don't know what else can be done. Russia has done the right thing now, but I think it's too little, too late. And I think the problem that Russia has done is it's went so far into backing the Assad regime that they can't actually go back now. Because to Russia, that would be a case of losing face. Russia is a proud country; it's a powerful country, and Putin doesn't want Moscow to lose face. But meanwhile, you have a situation where the Kremlin mouthpiece Russia Today has been actively promoting Assad's propaganda in order to justify Russia's actions in the region. Um, and I find that infuriating. This is, as far as I'm concerned, the greatest war crime of the 21st century, what's happening in Syria. And there's been many terrible things have happened, but I think this is arguably the biggest war crime of the 21st century. Um, and it really is a horrible situation. Um, Maybe the only way is for those rebel leaders to surrender, and maybe Russia could make some sort of negotiation with the Assad regime, treat them humanely. But Russia would then be taking the word of a regime that is not known for treating opposition. I mean, they would, that isn't even any sort of power sharing government is unthinkable because many Syrians rightly blame Assad for starting this. Let's not forget it was the Assad regime that chose to use brute force on legitimate protests. Those protests in 2011 were not Islamists, they weren't ISIS. They were ordinary people who were fed up of high unemployment, corruption, and human rights abuses. In other words, the same sort of grievances that were going on in the other countries affected by Arab Spring. Now, what we have seen is Syria is the most grim reminder that Arab Spring has become Arab Winter, and it's just horrible. Um, Upwards of 500,000 dead, a country in absolute ruins. I can't, I can't see how this ends, and that's so depressing. Um, so I'm not really making this to offer a particular solution, but when history comes to be written, no one should kid themselves that Russia's role has been morally benevolent, that Russia has somehow liberated Syria from ISIS, or the Assad regime has liberated Syria from ISIS. Arguably, it was Assad that helped create ISIS by creating the situation in his country that allowed ISIS to take advantage of that. As for the claim America created ISIS, um, well, what sense would that make when ISIS has targeted Western countries? Does that really make sense? Would it not make more sense to fund a terrorist organization that would target Russia or enemies of Western countries? That makes no sense. So it's a very flawed claim and one that I've seen very few people provide actual hard evidence for. Um, I would also urge people to be very wary of so-called independent journalists like Eva Bartlett. Um, Eva Bartlett is a Canadian journalist who a lot of people held up because, oh, Eva Bartlett tells the truth about the West. Eva Bartlett exposes the Western media's lies on Syria. There's a catch with that. Eva Bartlett was not independent. Eva Bartlett was a vocal supporter of the Assad regime, and she regularly appeared on Russia Today. So let's be very wary of the sort of propaganda that is out there to make Assad look good. This, as far as I'm concerned, Assad is a thoroughly evil man who is responsible for tens of thousands of civilian deaths, tens of thousands of people maimed and injured and tortured. And if there is an afterlife, this man will meet his judgment. I don't know. What will Syria be like in 2028, 2038, 2048? Will this be a situation where this is going to be as prolonged as the Afghan civil war is? Because technically, that's a collective name for the conflict in Afghanistan, and it didn't begin in 2001. It began in 1978 with the Soviet invasion. That's a 40-year conflict. So, will Syria go on for decades? God, I hope not. Um, I'll leave it there, but I will close with one point. I'm not going to, like I say, I'm not neutral in this. I have my views. I believe that Russia must take a great deal of blame for propping up this brutal Assad dictatorship. And I do believe, therefore, Russia is at least partly responsible for a lot of the suffering that is going on now. Um, but politics aside, finger pointing aside, anyone who's watching this, if you live in a country that's politically stable, that's peaceful, like the UK, like Canada, like Russia, if you live in a country that is relatively stable, be grateful. Be grateful for that. Be grateful that you don't are not going through the nightmare that the Syrian people are going through. And I will leave it there.